Good afternoon. My name is Mark Baldassare, and I'm President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of PPIC's Board of Directors and staff. We're very pleased to present this program today on the 2020 election and the implications for California. This event is part of the Sutton Family Speaker Series, and I'd like to take a moment to thank Tom and Marilyn Sutton and their family members, including Matt Sutton, who's here today. Their support makes this annual series possible. We really appreciate it. Before I make some brief remarks, please silence your cell phone. That even applies to our panelists here today. I know, you know? Right. Who I saw with their cell phones. Also, later today, you'll receive a short survey by email about this event. Please let us know how we did. We love surveys at PPIC, as you know. So some brief remarks to set up the conversation, which we have a distinguished panel and moderator here today. All eyes will be on California when voters make their choices in the upcoming presidential primary on March 3rd. Last year, California experienced a surge in voter registration and voting. On the heels of record low turnout in 2014, the 2018 election had the highest turnout for a midterm election in California since 1982. To help make sense of the state's voting patterns, PPIC has just released a new report titled California's Exclusive Electorate, which analyzes data from the last 9 waves of the PPIC statewide survey and includes responses from nearly 15,200 California adults. These latest findings build on a PPIC study that was first published in 2006 and then updated in 2016, and they help us set the context for the 2020 election preview event. In short, while much is changing in the electorate, many patterns stubbornly persist. So growth in political participation has been strong in the wake of significant changes in our state's election laws, and because, needless to say, we live in such interesting times. However, it's noteworthy that there are about 5 million California adults who are not eligible to vote. There are about 5 million eligible adults who are not registered to vote, and about 7 million registered voters did not cast ballots in the November 2018 election. If past trends are any indication, we would expect that about half of California's approximately 31 million adults will vote in the November 2020 general election, and far fewer will cast ballots in the March 2020 primary. Importantly, the demographic makeup of the electorate is not representative of the people of California. Voters in California tend to be white, affluent, college-educated, and homeowners. Non-voters are more likely to be younger, Latino, renters, low-income, less educated, and to self-identify as the have-nots in society. While some gaps have narrowed, a wide gulf remains between the voters and non-voters in California. Because of their stark differences, voters and non-voters are not aligned in their views of the role of government. For instance, only 41% of likely voters prefer a bigger government that provides more services, while 73% of non-voters and 54% of all adults do so. Preferences vary in similar ways when we ask questions about whether government should be doing more to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, or whether the government should be doing more to make sure that all people have an equal opportunity to get ahead in California. What would change if more non-voters turn out for the March primary and November election? Presidential candidates who favor a more expansive government role will get a boost, and so would proponents of state bond measures and citizens' initiatives to raise taxes on the wealthy. President Trump's approval rating here is much lower among non-voters than likely voters, 24% among non-voters, 38% among likely voters, and thus a higher turnout would also help the Democratic candidates in competitive U.S. House races, as it did in 2018. Expanding the electorate might also inject some idealism into what is a very cynical and divisive politics today. Non-voters are more optimistic about the prospect that Americans of different political views can still come together and work out their differences. California has a long way to go, but the movement toward a more representative electorate that we are starting to see is a step in the right direction for a state that calls on voters to make decisions that impact all of its residents. In the meantime, PPIC statewide surveys will continue to poll all adults so that elected officials can take into account the needs and wants of all of the people they were elected to represent, as well as the likely voters who tend to turn out in elections, in what will be a consequential election next year. Now it's time to get the conversation started, so I'd like to ask our distinguished panel to come up to the stage and join me. I'd like to get the conversation started by turning things over to KQED California Government and Politics correspondent Marisa Lagos. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Take it away.
Nice job.
Take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. I am very excited about this panel. Oh, there I am. Hi, everyone. Thank you guys so much for having us and for being here and for being engaged. I'm really excited. When PPIC first asked me to host this, I think maybe they said Tam was on the panel, but I didn't know. I said, yeah, it's PPIC, sure. And then they got Jessica and Rusty. So what a treat for everyone. I think this is your guys' second event together since being elected chairs. But I'm getting
count the flights we take from Burbank to Sacramento. Those people get a real treat.
You guys are gonna have maybe matching seats on Southwest or something. Well, let me back up and introduce them a little bit. Rusty Hicks, as many of you know, is the relatively new chair of the California Democratic Party. He was president of the LA County Federation for Labor, LA Fed's political director for 10 years before that, and served as California political director for the 2008 Obama campaign, among other distinguished things you've done. Thank you for being here, Rusty.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tamara Keith, some of you may remember from when she was at KQED. She is White House correspondent for National Public Radio, co-host of NPR's Politics podcast, and is on PBS, a news hour once a week. You shouldn't miss it. She previously covered Congress and business for NPR and California politics for KQED and KPCC. Tam, thanks for coming out. Good to be here. And in case you guys are wondering, President Trump followed Tam to California, not the other way around. He heard she was here and couldn't help himself. Jessica Patterson is the new chair of the California Republican Party and the first woman and Latina to serve in that role. She, like me, also has 2 young children, and actually Tam too. So we were all just trading mom travel notes. Before this, Jessica served the California Republican Party, the Republican National Committee, and statewide and national candidates. And she was CEO and co-founder of California Trailblazers, which helps recruit, train, and elect Republican candidates for office. Jessica, thanks for coming.
My pleasure.
So PPIC did give us an overarching thing here, which is how will California's voters and their priorities be influential in the 2020 election? It's a big question, but I thought kind of to open, maybe I would just sort of pose that to each of you, and we don't have to get too far in the weeds. Tam, maybe you to start, since you're coming from this national perspective. And we know that, historically California has been the piggy bank for presidential candidates of both sides of the aisle. Our primary has gone back and forth, but is now Super Tuesday. Do you think that coming into 2020, California stands to be a more important part of this presidential primary and contest than maybe 8 years ago?
So everyone might disagree with me, but guess what? You're still the piggy bank. The candidates are still doing a dash for cash. They still come to California to get money.
Right.
And now, though, they do at least one public event. So
make
they
us all
can get
feel
a
better.
little free media, get some coverage, get in front of people's eyeballs. What is not clear to me yet, and may not be clear for a while, may not be clear until after people are already voting on their absentee ballots here in California, is whether California will come into the process soon enough to really make a difference, or whether things will have already started settling out after Iowa and New Hampshire. Because delegates are awarded on a proportional basis, chances are this won't, and there are 21 people, chances are it won't totally be done by the time Super Tuesday comes around. But because delegates are awarded on a proportional basis, and because California takes approximately a century to count all of its absentee ballots,
That's a bit of a stretch.
okay, like 2 weeks,
Like a half
3
a
weeks.
century?
2 decades.
Yes, 2 decades. Yeah. There is a chance that the race will have already advanced a lot by the time California's results are fully in.
Wow.
Sorry.
Sobering. No. Rusty, let's start with you. So, as chair of the Democratic Party, I mean, understanding that both of you guys are pretty new to this, but I mean, are Democrats approaching this differently because of the earlier primary, and just what a robust field the Democratic primary has become compared to the last couple election cycles?
I think more than anything else, we see it as an opportunity. Yes, candidates are still coming for the cash, but they are getting to parts of the state that they typically would not get to. Now, you do have to get at least 15% in the primary in order to get any delegates. Therefore, we might have 21 candidates, but 6, 7 are probably going to end up with delegates. But it means that you have top-tier candidates going to the northern rural parts of the state. They're going to the Central Valley. They're going to the Inland Empire. They're going to places that typically top-tier presidential candidates would go in a primary. And so I see it as a real opportunity to showcase the state and how you can have a high-road, robust debate of ideas in many different parts of our state, which I believe are in many ways reflective of the rest of the country. It's more than the Bay Area and Los Angeles. You can look at California as having a piece of every part of the country.
I mean, Jessica, a little different on the Republican side. There are a couple lower tier challengers to the president, but we're not expecting that same sort of primary fight. What opportunities are you seeing for your party with this earlier primary specifically? And then we'll talk about November in a little bit.
So we certainly see opportunity as well. We have the opportunity to change the entire makeup of the building across the street. We see people that are really upset. We see an opportunity to not be 50th in the nation when it comes to business. We see an opportunity to fix our K through 12 education that are failing students. We see an opportunity to be able to go out there and talk to, that 53% of Californians that believe they're going to have to leave our state. So we see it as an opportunity too. And we're definitely going to be focused on making sure we're engaging in communities to talk about those messages, to talk about the things that are important to them, and really focus on fixing our state.
So do you then see this, as more of a sort of setup in terms, everyone here knows 2018 was not a great year for Republicans in California. You guys lost 7 congressional seats. There's a supermajority in both houses of the legislature. Is the primary a real key moment in that rebuilding for your party and for these top 2 primaries?
Well, certainly, and we see a challenge there with what happened with SB 27 and California Democrats trying to keep
get right into it.
trying to keep the likely Republican nominee off the ballot. So we certainly see it, and it's going to be a challenge for us to make sure that we're getting out there in communities. I believe that it will be overturned in court, And I think that we will, hopefully set a precedent for any other legislatures that try and do this. But it will be a challenge for us to make sure that we are out there turning people out, because we do see it as a voter suppression tactic.
I'm glad you said that, because you told me that last week, and I wanted to ask Rusty about that. I mean, the sense was that this was a SB, what, 27? 27. A lot of SBs and ABs floating around right now, guys.
Right.
This was the bill that Jerry Brown had vetoed, Governor Newsom just signed. It would require any presidential candidate on the primary ballot to release their tax returns, obviously seen as an attack on Trump and his reelection bid. But what Jessica is making the argument is that this was really about suppressing Republican turnout in the primary, because Trump will end up on the ballot either way in November. Is that a fair characterization?
I said it last week, and I'd say it again. I believe that Trump is the greatest GOTV machine that we could ever have. So my hope is that he simply honors his commitment to the American people and releases tax returns and let us know who exactly he is working for. I don't think it's unfair to ask the occupant in the White House to keep his word to the American people.
Tam, is this something you've seen any other states follow suit, or like is a conversation that's being talked about in DC and elsewhere?
It is being talked about a little bit, but not a lot. Certainly, the Republican primary is not a great mystery as to how this is going to turn out. Obviously, there are challengers who we've spoken to and covered a little bit, but their goal doesn't necessarily seem to be becoming president of the United States. They say that they have a goal of potentially denying President Trump renomination, but you don't have to push them very hard for them to say, well, yes, but we have secondary goals because we realize this isn't possible. I think that the idea of trying to make law out of what had previously been a norm, which is it had been the norm for presidential candidates to always release their tax returns. There is certainly a desire on the part of Democrats, some at the state level and not just California, but also congressional Democrats who obviously don't control both chambers. There is some desire to make what had been a norm a law. But that is not something that President Trump would ever sign. It is not something that Mitch McConnell would ever take up in the Senate. So this is not something, this is the kind of thing that is going to stay at the state level and will be litigated.
And we assume will be litigated prior to the primary, or at least when ballots start getting printed, right? Like in December.
Which is shockingly soon.
Right, I think that's part of the conversation here. I'm curious, like, what you guys think about how things will shape up. Rusty, you mentioned that, candidates have come here. We know President Trump is here for a visit. He's talking a lot about homelessness, which we can get into in a moment. But the idea that, like, we will already have our absentee ballots when Iowans are going to their caucuses and, people in New Hampshire going to the polls. How do you guys think that impacts this? Because it is, we, like, as Tam sort of alluded to, it's like voting has become this, like, sort of seasonal ritual. It's not just one day here in California when you add up the absentee and the counting. Jessica, do you see that making a difference in terms of what you're focused on?
Yeah, it gives us more time to make the argument, right? With the presidential, we have our likely nominee. And so our focus is going to be on legislative and congressional seats. And we will be out there talking to people every single day about the issues that are important to them. Some of the things that we're doing at the Republican Party to make sure that gets done, just for a little bit of context, we're communicating with people more than we ever have in the past. When you look at our communications for August of 2018, an election year, we sent out 50,000 emails. In August of 2019, we sent out 1.3 million. We're engaging people on the donor side. We have 20,000 brand new volunteers in the last 6 weeks. So these are things that we're focused on because we know that once we get to that primary, a lot of decisions have to be made. A big part of that is making sure we recruit great candidates. And we have fantastic candidates all around the state.
Can you put some numbers quickly, and then we'll move to Rusty on how many legislative seats are you? What success look like November, well, maybe December 2020 when the votes are counted.
Likely sometime after Thanksgiving. So, holding on to what we have is incredibly important to us. That is our number one goal. We want to make sure we hold on to everything that we have. I think that it's reasonable for us to pick up 2 assembly seats. There's really only 1 Senate seat that I believe that we have an opportunity in. And then on the congressional side, it will largely depend on some of these primaries, who ends up coming out of them. But I think we have the opportunity to pick up 3 to 4 seriously.
Rusty, you might have a different take on that. What does success? I mean, what does success look like for Democrats? Are there other seats you guys are targeting? Is it holding on to what you have? How are you going into 2020 in terms of those legislative and congressional races?
Certainly, I agree. Protecting and preserving what you have is priority number 1. Having a regional-based strategy that would allow you to pivot quickly if you saw an opportunity to pick up another seat. But certainly, it really is preparing for 22, 24, 26. I think in many ways, simply given traditional, historic turnout models that you're likely to see in California in a presidential year, I think being able to pick up additional, or to take back additional seats that were lost in 2018 by Republicans, I think is a pretty uphill climb. We're not going to take anything for granted. We're going to ensure that we defend those seats tooth and nail, and also look for opportunities where we might be able to pick up something else.
Yeah, like how about Congressional District 50, for example? Duncan Hunter is under investigation. Darrell Issa has made some moves that indicating he might challenge him. Rusty, is that an opportunity? If you have like 2 Republicans fighting it out in a primary, is that an opportunity in a district that Democrats, have sort of salivated over, but is a harder math, so to speak?
Hey, look, my view is there's 7 Republican members of Congress in California, which means that there are 7 too many. And so all of them, with all due respect to my Republican friends in the room, as the chair of the California Democratic Party, I'm going to go after absolutely every single one of them, because I think that's important to the overall delegation.
Jessica, how challenging is that when you have an incumbent who's under investigation, a sort of stalwart member of the party who resigned his old seat? How do you deal with that as party chair?
I'm the chairwoman of the California Republican Party. I'm used to uphill battles. So the great thing about the country that we live in is that Congressman Hunter will have his day in court. We also have fantastic candidates that, again, are out there making their case to the voters in that area. Candidates that have, been a part of those communities. Candidates that, I think that at the end of the day, we will end up with a Republican congressional member from there.
Tam, what does this look like nationally? Like, we hear a lot of talk on the Democratic side about trying to take back the Senate. What's your sense on the House math and how that looks for both parties broadly?
A lot is going to be determined by what's happening at the top of the ticket, like a lot. And there are a number of Democrats who were elected in Trump seats, basically, in districts where President Trump carried them, and then Democrats defeated a Republican incumbent in those congressional districts. Those Democrats have a much more challenging road ahead, and they are looking at what the House majority is doing, or some of the conversations that are happening in the House of Representatives, and they're a little nervous because they ran on, we're going to go to Washington and we are going to get things done, and look, I'm very moderate. And they individually can continue to say that, look, I'm very moderate, but there is a whole lot of impeachment talk happening, and other things that, these candidates ran on. And I think that Nancy Pelosi would say that, they ran on healthcare. They ran on prescription drug prices. They ran on protecting the Affordable Care Act. And they kind of want to be able to run on that again in 2020. And so how the national conversation goes, how the top of the ticket conversation goes, might affect their ability to run on the idea of, being a moderate force.
I mean, that's a narrative we're hearing more and more, is that in places like Iowa, where like retail politics had historically been king, that there's a much more sort of broader attention being paid to the national politics. You mentioned to me that politics is replacing football as like the sort of national sport. Like, talk about what the conversations are in states that don't look like California around this sort of debate. And I mean, isn't that a good thing? Like, it sounds like people are engaged.
Yeah, people are absolutely engaged to a level that is unheard of and possibly unhealthy for their mental health. I mean, people are...
Are you talking about us?
No, we're all intervention.
No, this last time I checked is your job.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of Americans who are so obsessed with national politics that it is taking up brain space in a way that may not be healtly. It is.
There are members.
Yes. Yes. No, but they're
They go to both conventions, believe me.
But so I've spent a lot of time in Iowa and New Hampshire over the last 6-8 months, interviewing presidential candidates, going to events for candidates who are no longer even in the race anymore. And I have met a lot of people not from Iowa and New Hampshire. I've met
Primary
Californians.
tourists?
There are tourists. There is an intense political tourism going on, where people from states that don't get the same love and attention from presidential candidates are going to these early voting states to get their moment. And you have these candidates who do this very quaint, I'm gonna really identify with you Iowans and New Hampshire and people, and I'm gonna say you guys take your politics so seriously, and I love running for president because it's so special that you can have these special moments with one-on-one moments with voters. I'm not pretending to be any particular candidate. I'm just saying I've heard all of them say that line. And then you start talking to people in the audience at their event, and you're like, oh, very nice to meet you, person from Connecticut, person from Virginia, person from California.
Person who cannot vote in the Iowa caucus.
Person who cannot vote in Iowa or New Hampshire.
That is fascinating. Wow. So guys, book your tickets now. There's plenty of room. I guess the state fair's over. But.
At the Iowa State Fair, where I was on vacation.
So you're a part of the cottage industry.
Wait. Yeah, let's back up here a little bit.
I was really going to the Field of Dreams, and then since I was there anyway during the Iowa State Fair, I just thought I would go. And it turns out lots of other people had the same idea.
Yeah.
There's a lot of political tourism going on.
I'm a political reporter, and I think that's weird. But okay, I'm glad people are engaged. So one of the big reasons we know that people are engaged is our president. As I said, he touched down today in California. He is doing some fundraisers, talking about homelessness. The head secretary, Ben Carson, is in San Francisco as well. Rusty, I guess to start, last week there was some news that sort of leaked ahead of this, I would say on purpose leaked, that there was a promise that the Trump administration was going to come in and crack down on homelessness in California. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I think crack down was the word, and how everyone here in California looked at that with a little suspicion. Clearly the administration's tactics to this point don't bode well for him coming in good faith to address a problem. Why would he cut $9.6 billion out of homeless programs? Why would he look to take health care away from regular Americans? Why would he look to get rid of the mortgage deduction that we have here in California? So certainly the governor and a number of leaders stepped forward and says, here's how you can help solve the problem. 50,000 vouchers that would ensure that we take folks off the street today. That's all of the veterans that are homeless. That's all of the chronically homeless, and would make a dent in those families that are homeless. And so I think if the Trump administration wants to come to California in good faith, I believe leaders here in this state are prepared to partner with the administration to address what is obviously a really challenging problem for the state.
Someone didn't get the phone memo, I think.
Yes.
Jessica, I mean, what's your reaction? Are you happy to see the president come here and talk about this issue? And do you think that there is a legitimate role that the federal government could be partnering with California on this?
Absolutely. I think that we all recognize, this is a crisis at epidemic proportions. And I think that California, I think America is at its best when we find ways to work together. When we had the fires in Paradise and we had then Governor Brown, Governor-elect Newsom, Leader McCarthy, and the president all here in Paradise and in Malibu. When we had the earthquake in Trona and, the governor sent a tweet thanking the federal government and the president for what they're doing. People want to see us work together. I don't spend a lot of time quoting Van Jones, but when the First Step Act was, and people were like, well, were you shocked? And he said, you know what? There are some people that get so focused on coming from a place of no, right? You have to believe it in order to see it. If you don't believe that it can happen, you'll never be able to see it. And I think that most Californians and most Americans want to find ways where we can set aside petty politics and we can focus on getting things done for the people here. And the homeless crisis is certainly something that, in everything that I've seen, I'm sure research and PPIC is a huge issue for Californians.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the other sort of, what I would imagine is a double-edged sword for you as head of the Republican Party is the president's record and role in immigration, the wall debate, the asylum seeker, this is a state where some people think that the registration numbers you're dealing with now can be traced back to Pete Wilson and Prop 187 and anti-immigrant sentiment over 20 years ago. How are you framing this when you talk to people? Because I know part of your charge is to expand the number of people in your party, and a lot of those are Latinos who might have problems with the way this president has approached immigration or other immigrants.
So on the policy side of things, I usually leave it up to the policymakers. My job as the California Republican Party chair is to make sure that we have enough Republicans to make a difference. And so candidate recruitment is something that's huge for us. Being able to recruit candidates like Congressman Valadao, the son of immigrants, like Assemblywoman Young Kim, an immigrant herself, like Supervisor Michelle Park Still, an immigrant herself. Republicans have been talking about the humanitarian crisis at the border for a very long time. And nobody paid attention to what they were saying until some Democrats went there. And they've been working on this issue. It is something that needs to be fixed. I believe that it can best be fixed by us taking back the House. And so my job is to make sure that I can recruit those good candidates that know the issue and can work on the issue and find solutions, because that's what people care about. They want solutions.
Well, let me push back a little, because you guys had the House and nothing happened around immigration. The president hasn't even been able to get money for the wall out of Republicans in Congress. I mean, why should anyone believe that that would solve this problem?
Well, I think that there was a lot that they tackled in those first 2 years. And unfortunately, immigration didn't make it to the top of the stack. But I think that it is something that everybody sees as a huge humanitarian crisis, and we need to find a fix to it.
Do you see it as a challenge for your candidates to win back seats, given where the president is?
I think that our candidates have dealt with the issue personally, and they can speak to it in a way that others can't.
Rusty, how are you going to approach this in 2020?
Well, I would say in fairness, you might have candidates that have an amazing background. But the question is what message are they telling? What story are they trying to sell? And let's not talk about what's happened at the federal level. Let's just talk about what's happened in California. Republicans in the Assembly and the Senate had the opportunity to step forward and provide health insurance for undocumented seniors. They voted no. They had the opportunity to ensure that we didn't use the state's communications infrastructure to be used for federal immigration enforcement. They voted no. Since 1994, Republicans have been saying to Latinos and immigrants, we don't like you. And so it's my view that we generally never like someone who doesn't like us or we don't feel who likes us. And so it's no wonder that 60% of Latinos are registered Democrats. And so I think it is great, and I certainly commend the candidate recruitment that's taken place, because I know how incredibly hard it really is. But the question is, what message are they going to put forward? And I think that's where the real challenge for the California Republican Party really is.
I mean,
And
what
that
about
message?
Yeah.
That message is to talk about what's happened here, especially in the state legislature. People in these types of communities aren't living their best life because of the policies of California Democrats. And they're not voting for Democrats because they're living their best lives here. We tout that we're the 5th largest economy in the world, and what does that mean for most people? And so being able to talk to them about the failed policies of Democrats, that's the message we'll talk to them about. And we are going to be engaging, and have been engaging, in communities that have not just felt neglected by my party over the years, but that have actually been neglected by my party. We have to do a better job because they are not living their best life under one-party rule here in Sacramento.
I want to come back to Tam, but quickly, Rusty, I do want to talk to you because, I think that what you'll hear Jessica say, what other Republicans have run on, is this idea that Democrats do own California, that if there's something broken here, that it's Democrats' fault. And I think that this issue of homelessness and the Trump administration coming here and talking about it does provide a potentially potent message for the GOP in this state. I mean, how do you want to talk about that with voters, and what's the response?
But the message is, this is what's wrong. There's not a solution. So if you're going to make a change, you got to provide a solution. Democrats are trying to address really almost an intractable, complex, complicated issue, putting money in the budget for housing and for homelessness, all without the support of Republicans. And so, I guess my response would be, it's okay to point out the issues, but if you're going to see some change, you got to put forward a solution.
All right, Tam, let's zoom out a little bit. We're talking about two really hot button issues here, immigration and homelessness. Obviously, President Trump has made immigration a centerpiece of his campaign, starting from the moment he announced for presidency. It seems to me that the view of that issue is very different in border states than it is in other parts of the country. I mean, we've seen, Republicans like Will Hurd come out and be a lot more moderate on that issue and then resign.
Are retiring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, how, understanding that nobody can predict the future, but I mean, how potent do you think this issue will remain for Republicans? Do you see any problems with it, given how divisive the issue has become?
I mean, people that I talk to see this, there's like a short-term window and there's a long-term window. And the short-term window, certainly in the view of President Trump, is that short-term, it works. Short-term, it excites his base. The farther you get away from the border, the more concerned people are about immigration and immigrants. And it is, for the president, a symbol of something more. It is not just about actual immigration policy. It is about it is a symbol of change and of things aren't the way they used to be, and that whole "Make America Great Again" is about going back to a different time. And so for the president, for his base, he really believes, I mean, I guess I can't say what he believes, but he certainly acts like someone who thinks that it is going to work again. And obviously, all presidents are fighting the last war. All presidents, President Obama thought if he could just give a really good speech, he could convince anyone of anything, because that's how he got to be president of the United States in a way. And President Trump continues to think that if he can just keep tweeting and keep firing people up, making them angry, fueling culture wars, and battles over paper straws and homelessness in California. I mean, it's not about homelessness in California. It is about talking about failed policies of Democrats. It is about creating a narrative about, poor, socialist policies leading to the degradation of America as we know it. That is the pitch that he's making. So short term, he and his campaign think that this is going to work. Long term, you talk to, hand-wringing Republican pollsters who will tell you this isn't sustainable. That they don't think that you can continue that sort of message of division and continue to have a growing, thriving party. But it could well work in the short term.
Yeah. Jessica, I mean, how do you view this? I think it seems to me like, all due respect, like you don't really want to talk about the president and the policy issues, and it seems like that's because it is a divisive issue and one that could make it harder to do your job.
Well, I'm not a policymaker, and so I usually talk about the political side of things, which is what I have control over. I get that some people wake up and the first thing they want to do is check out whatever the 3 a.m. tweet was. I get up every morning, I get my girls.
Some of us have alerts and we can't avoid it.
I get up every morning and I make sure that, when I'm home, I'm getting my girls breakfast, I'm getting them out to school. I am making sure that I'm raising 2 good human beings and that my husband still loves me, and which is sometimes challenging with all of the running around the state that I do. But that has to be our focus. If I want to be successful here in California, and not just help our party, but to help our state, we have to get back to a place where we can win races. And so I worry about the things that I can control, and there are some things that I can't control. And so my focus will always be here in California, talking about issues that are important to people, recruiting good candidates, making sure we have the infrastructure, and getting people excited about what California Republicans are doing.
I mean, speaking of infrastructure, Tam, I know that the Trump campaign is in a very different place than they were 4 years ago at this point. They are more integrated with the RNC. We've been seeing months, maybe years of digital ads. Talk about that, and then I want to talk to the party chairs about what that means for them. But what is the differences you're seeing now compared to Trump's first campaign?
So his first campaign was sort of a band of pirates. It was, I think they described themselves as that. It was President Trump and his Twitter feed and a few people and Brad Parscale doing some digital things. And yes, they had campaign managers, but really Jared Kushner was very involved, and it was all a very small group. And then he won the nomination. And there was this very uneasy relationship between the RNC and the Trump campaign. Very uneasy. And there were touch and go moments, especially around the Access Hollywood video and some other things, where there was a question of whether the RNC was going to stick with him. And the Trump people were always deeply suspicious of the RNC people, all the way through to the end, all the way through into the early part of the administration. But now they are one and the same. It's all one unit. To give you a little view behind the curtain, sometimes the Trump campaign people aren't responding to me, so I go to the RNC, and then all of a sudden the Trump campaign people respond to me.
We're trying that with Jessica too.
So it is one unit. They are cohesive. I talk to people on the ground in New Hampshire and Iowa, state party people, and they tell me about how they've got their Trump victory person who is a staff person who is showing up to the farmer's market every week. They are building a Death Star this time. Last time they were a Millennium Falcon, this time they're a Death Star. I realize that analogy doesn't totally work because there were flaws in the Death Star.
I've never seen Star Wars.
Yeah, there were fatal flaws in the Death Star, but the idea is that they are building this big apparatus. They are raising a ton of money. A lot of it is coming from $20 every 2 weeks from grandmas. They launched the campaign, they officially became a campaign the day of the inauguration, and the money just on a monthly subscriber thing, it just kept coming in these small amounts. And now they also have big donor programs, which you know more about than I do probably, but they have bundler programs. They are things that President Trump turned his nose up at 4 years ago. Now he is actively and eagerly seeking campaign funds from Bush people and from
Sounds
And-
kind of swampy.
Oh, I mean, it's politics.
Right.
I mean, like,
That's the irony of anybody sort of claiming
Right.
that they're going to
But-
be an
but
outsider. I mean, on both sides.
the president's allies essentially say that last time the band of pirates was able to win, this time they don't intend to take a chance. And so they are raising a lot of money, spending a lot of money, and they have a lot of money to spend. So that's why you're seeing these ads.
Yeah. Is any of that being spent in California, Jessica? And does that help what you're doing?
So we have a great relationship with the RNC, and their focus for here will be congressional seats. Yeah. And so the 7 that we lost, those are the ones that we're looking at, and depending on who comes out of the primaries, there have been endorsements made in a few of the races already by the state Republican Party. So there will always be a relationship there, and we know that a lot of California visits are focused on the fundraising. And so we, as the California Republican Party, have always made a commitment to do the heavy lifting on the finance side ourselves. And so that's why it's important that on the financial side, we have 6,800 brand new donors to the California Republican Party this year, which in comparison to 2017 is a 70% increase. We have $500,000 ahead of where we were cash on hand 2 years ago. We have $1.3 million more in commitments than we did 2 years ago. We know that we are always going to have to depend on ourselves, and it's a very Republican principle anyway. So it is something that we focus on.
Rusty, I mean, how are you viewing this in terms of, does the president's campaign and the fact that it is, better organized, better funded, more integrated with the RNC pose a challenge here in California? Or is that more an issue kind of in other places?
I think it's something that we certainly are watching and monitoring and certainly feel the impact of, because the band of pirates will need the infrastructure to be successful in 2020, not just nationally, but to have a chance in some of these congressional seats. I mean, I think if you look at the TJ Cox seat. So TJ Cox won with 862 votes under a 60% turnout model in a district that is 72% Latino. Whether you try to separate yourself from what's happening in Washington, D.C., whether you try to separate yourself from the top of the ticket, in a presidential election, you're likely to see anywhere from a 7 to 9% bump in a district like that, which is 90% of which are going to be Latinos. So you're going to have a challenge of separating your message from the top of the ticket that is so anti-immigrant, trying to win some of these Rust Belt states, southern states, Wisconsin, which may be the place where the presidency comes down to. But I think it's a real challenge, even in those 7 congressional seats, even if you're trying to divorce yourself from the president.
Well, I mean, the other challenge, and this is obviously nationally, but I wonder how it impacts those districts, is this issue that Tam hit on, which is like Trump and the campaign and the RNC have been spending millions on digital ads for months, years. Democrats are still fighting over, not just who wins the primary, but like who's at the next debate stage. I mean, does that, do you see that as an opportunity in terms of like people are really engaged, or do you think that, it gives Republicans a head start?
I mean, look, if you're the sitting president, you do have a head start, because Trump, whether you like him or not, is a fundraising machine. Low dollar, small dollar, and big dollar, especially when you can make tax cuts that get passed through and come back around as like a campaign contribution in many ways. I'm sure all legal, but there's a very clear line between those things. So I don't think there's a question that Republicans have a head start. But keep in mind, Republicans had 17, 18 candidates in 2015, 2016, and they got a Republican in the White House. So I'm not concerned about having 21 Democrats on the stage. I do think that the DNC's process is an attempt to thoughtfully winnow down to a field that is, digestible for voters in 2020.
Tam, I want to ask you, how you think DC, and I realize that's a big term, but views California right now, because, Republicans had control of both houses. Democrats took back the House in part by winning seats here. I heard Darrell Issa talk about how you need, that there's a sense of this state being so fractured that sometimes it can be hard to make the case for people in DC to take seriously on one side of the aisle or the other. So beyond just the president, do you think California, the view of California has changed at all in the last couple of years, politically?
Tell us what you like about us.
Yeah, what do you miss, Tam? No, but just...
No, but I think that certainly 2018 proved the relevance of California, that it became this, it became a state that, because Democrats were able to win a lot of seats that they weren't even necessarily expected to win, that it was, it was a majority maker in the House. But
we also see Nancy Pelosi gets put in more ads than any other person across the nation, and seats she has nothing to do with, right?
Well, and Kevin McCarthy. Basically California is running DC, but
but we get no respect, I feel.
Yeah. but if you want to talk about influence, Kevin McCarthy has the president's ear. Kevin McCarthy, President Trump went to North Carolina for a rally and to tour some storm damage, and Kevin McCarthy was with him. So you have both the Speaker of the House and you have someone who has the president's ear.
So some power there. All right,
Yeah,
I want to
you
talk
got
a little
something.
bit...
And the money.
And the money. I want to talk a little bit about the research that PPIC put out today, looking at sort of who the electorate is here in California. And what they essentially found is that voters look very different from non-voters. Voters are whiter, older, more affluent, more likely to be college educated, homeowners. Non-voters are more likely to be younger, Latina, lower income, less educated, and renters. And there's a quote in here that California's electorate does not reflect the size, growth, or diversity of California's population. And it goes on to detail how non-voters actually favor bigger government. So this is a softball question for Rusty, but I assume you want more of those people voting. How are you going to do that?
Well, I think that's why you have Democratic majorities speaking not just to likely voters, but attempting to improve the lives of all Californians and even that big non-voter occasional slice.
But how are you going to actually do it? Because I feel like the story of Latinos coming out and changing everything in California is one we have been talking about, certainly as long as I've been a political reporter. And, the actual turnout is never as high as people kind of on your side want it to be.
I think it's easy to say that you should be able to pass a particular policy or put forward a particular candidate and you will change voting habits. But they're voting habits. There are those, probably many of which are in this room, vote every single election, like someone who lives by themselves but makes their bed every day. It is a habit that they do no matter what.
That is amazing.
And I think how you form a habit is over time. And that's why you've seen, in particular, Latino turnout increase over time. At some point, Latinos are currently 35% of the population. They're 21% in the likely turnout, I believe, if my numbers aren't mixed up. But at some point, they're going to match where they're at in the population or even be overrepresented. So that doesn't happen overnight. I think that takes putting forward policies that improve their lives. I think it requires giving them a seat at the table. I think it requires putting candidates forward that are attractive to the occasional voter community, specifically Latinos.
I mean, Jessica, if you look at this poll and what it shows policy-wise, the difference between voters and non-voters, it would almost seem like Republicans wouldn't want to register these folks because they don't agree with you.
Well, I think that it does give us an opportunity because it's very clear that there are many people in California that have felt forgotten. They've felt forgotten by the people that are representing them. And so much so that they're not even registering and or if they are registered, not voting. And so I think it gives us an opportunity to talk about what we would do. It gives us an opportunity to talk about the failures and then engage them and get them to be Republicans. I think it's a huge opportunity for us.
I mean, do you worry, there's a lot of talk after 2018 about voter suppression and efforts in other states to really keep Democrats at home. I mean, does that hurt those conversations you're having?
So the only voter suppression that people are talking about with me is the one that's happening with SB 27. And the fact that California
Nothing about
Democrats,
Georgia or Florida or any of those
no,
other states?
really, these conversations are, we have a motor voter program that was flawed from the beginning that was quickly pushed out. We have absentee ballot, harvesting that's going on here. California Democrats have legalized and normalized what would be considered fraud in most of our country. And so those are the types of conversations that people are having here. People hold the ballots very, very sacred.
Let me just respond to this. Look, the state has never been good at computerizing much of anything.
Understatement.
But there is no connection to, quote, fraud connected to the DMV issue. Incompetence, yes. Fraud, no. I think what's important is that Democrats have put forward measures time and time again to make it easier to vote, whether it's lowering the age to vote, having a return postage, having regional vote centers, on and on and on, and Republicans time and time again oppose these measures. So I recognize it's an opportunity, but given the opportunity, Republicans in the state legislature have not stepped forward and taken full advantage of that.
I mean, Rusty has a point, Jessica. Like, you're saying you're worried about whether the vote is free and fair, but there has not, it does seem like every proposal Democrats put forward to expand the electorate is opposed by Republicans, and at a certain point that looks pretty political given the data we have about who's not voting.
I think that when you look at the chain of custody issues that we had in North Carolina, the reason why we had to have an re-election there. I think that people all over the country, when they're looking at what California Democrats are doing, they're not looking at us as an example of what to be.
Tam, what's your sense, in terms of how much what happened in 2018 around Russia, the conversation we're having right here, conversations of voter suppression, questions about the, automatic motor voter thing, do you feel like the electorate's confidence has been shaken in the system?
That's a very good question. Our election system, speaking broadly, is not made for close calls. There are a lot of things where if you look too closely, it looks scary. And when there are close calls, all of a sudden you see things that, there's not a great system for resolving some of these close calls. And generally I'm not articulating this well, but it just hasn't been dealt with as a nation because there haven't been that many close calls.
And I mean, one of the strengths and weaknesses is how decentralized it is too, right?
Absolutely, and it is very decentralized. It's not even at the state level, it's at the county level. I mean, obviously some stuff is state and some is federal, but elections are managed at the local level and there are varying levels of competence and there are still I think it's 12% of voting machines will not have 12% of voters will vote on machines that do not have a voter verified paper trail in 2020. So there's a lot of work still to be done, but it's also something where there hasn't been that much investment.
Is the conversation in DC sort of similar to what we have here along party lines? Is there any bipartisan efforts that you've seen to step in and do anything about the sort of myriad of voting issues we've seen in recent years?
I mean, there are certainly members of Congress on committees that take it very seriously. These things don't get a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And, in some ways, maybe it's probably not good. These things should get attention. But in other ways, if you pay too much attention, it gets really scary.
So just don't look.
So don't, yeah. We have about 10 minutes left. I'm curious, I mean, you guys, as we said, this is, I think, your second event together. You've obviously disagree on a lot of issues. What opportunities do you see to work together as parties?
Good question.
Well,
I stumped them.
Please.
look, I think we
We all hold hands.
Yeah.
No, I think we all have an interest in ensuring that we have an engaged and empowered electorate. I think to the extent that whatever the partisanship divide might be, it does sort of advantage my party. But I really want people to show up and vote, right? And in all honesty, yes, I'm a Democrat. I want people to vote Democrat. But I may not be the chair of the California Democratic Party after I say this, but I do think just simple participation in and of itself is a core part of the fundamental democratic values that, I think we approach in very different ways, but is important to our democracy.
So for me, I said it in the beginning, I think America is at our best when we are finding ways to work together. And right now we have one party rule here. So my job, getting more Republicans up here to get better or less bad legislation through, is something that's incredibly important to me. And I didn't run to be the state party chairwoman just to, help the Republican Party. I did it to help our state because I think that our state is at a turning point. And I think that if we continue down this road, we're going to fall off the edge. And so everywhere that we find places to work together, and by we, I mean the people that we elect to these positions, I give credit where credit is due. When the governor sent out a tweet thanking the president and the federal government for their help with the earthquake in Trona, I liked his tweet. Most Republicans will probably be mad at me for that. But I think it's important. I think that it's better for all of us when we find ways that we can work together and get good things through.
All right. We do have a few minutes left. That sounded like a nice ending point, but I'm going to keep going. So one thing that we haven't really discussed at all is like the rest of the ballot other than candidates in California. We know that we really like ballot measures here, like a lot. Arguably too much so, because then you can't change them. But one of the ones that I assume you two will be on opposite sides of is the Prop 13 split roll proposal. This is obviously to change the 1978 law, so commercial properties would not be included in that. Rusty, you came from a labor background. This is a labor proposal. How hard of an issue is this, just in terms of like educating people on, or do you think people understand it? And like what impact do you see it possibly having on the rest of the races you're working on?
Well, I obviously we'll have a convention in November, and the delegates of the party will take up this issue and consider it. I know that from my vantage point, we're going to stand on the side of working people. And I think ensuring that we have a well-funded public education system in the state is particularly important. And I think there has been, this battle has been brewing for the better part of a decade. So there has been, a lot of groundwork that has gone into getting this measure to this point. So I'm not overly concerned with our ability to be able to link it with all the other initiatives that we would be supportive of, and also believe that can be helpful to candidates and not just seen as harmful.
Yeah. I mean, Jessica, I assume you'll be talking about this as a business, from the business angle. But as Rusty pointed out, property taxes go to schools. Like, what's the case going to be in terms of the conservative argument?
Well, I think that, this is another case where you talk about doing what's right for the working families here, but it just ends up making California more expensive. And I think that the Business Roundtable did a fantastic job of rolling out their coalition on this, and it is an incredibly diverse coalition that is not just business people. It really is about Californians. And when long before I was running for chairs, I sat at a political affairs conference, similar style, and they asked me, what do we do now in this type of environment? And my answer to them is find as many things as you can to stick together on. Because one by one, they're picking off the industries. It may be death by 1,000 cuts, or it'll be with one fell swoop of the pen like the bail bond industry. And so the more places where we can find our common ground, find the things that we agree on, the better we'll do for our state.
All right. I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Marisa, fabulous moderating job. Thank you so much. Distinguished panelists, thank you for joining us today. So I know we have a hard stop at 1:30, but I'm a pollster, so I have to ask one question. And this includes for you too. So when we look back at moving the California primary from June to March, will we say this was a good thing or a bad thing? Marisa, we'll start with you, Marisa.
I mean, I think just as like a Californian, probably a good thing because we're at least semi-relevant this year, but
Okay.
we'll see.
Rusty?
Good.
Because?
Well, I think as I said before, I think it gives us the opportunity to showcase the state and to engage an electorate and to engage activists in a way in which we haven't been able to before.
And Tamara, from the national perspective?
I see no harm in it.
Okay. And Jessica?
Yeah, I don't know that it's going to make much of a difference.
Okay. Very good. Thank you. And how about the audience? A good thing that we have a march or a bad thing? Raise your hand if you think it's a bad thing. Oh, okay. So mainly a good thing. So I think it'd be a good thing if everybody went out and voted in March too. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you once again to Tom and Marilyn Sutton and Matt Sutton and the Sutton family. And stay tuned for more from PPIC in terms of events. And have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks again. Thank you so much, Marisa.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful.